Welcome everyone to track 3, Overcoming the Valley of Death in Research, which will be led by Danny Levine. Our panelists also include Sharie Haugabook, Christopher Hopkins, Michael Hund, and Yael Weiss.
Thanks so much. So we're going to talk about the Valley of Death, which is a fairly ominous term, but also for good reason. Sharie, you're someone who's worked both in academic research as well as doing drug discovery at big pharmaceutical companies. What is the Valley of Death, and why does it exist?
So the space, once you have selected a candidate to conduct studies and activities that will enable your IND for clinical research, clinical development, that space after discovery is considered the Valley of Death. And the reason for that is it requires additional expertise. It requires bringing together a group of scientists and researchers and management, but it's also very expensive. And it's important that you communicate very well and coordinate those activities in order for you to get to that point towards getting it into the clinic. So the molecule and management, I'm going to say the 2 M's, are critical. I'm sure there are additional parts, but the molecule is going to reveal itself. It's going to do what it's going to do. You cannot control that to any extent. And safety and efficacy is important there. And it's going to tell you what it's going to tell you. But you do have control over how you manage those activities, how you plan out those activities. And if you fail there, you can actually be part of that Valley of Death. I'll just...
You say it's expensive, but I think of it, the barrier being more that it's very high risk for an investor. And I'm wondering, we talk about de-risking molecules to attract biopharmaceutical interest in development. I'd like to hear from all of you on this. What does it take to de-risk a molecule and get to a point where a drug developer might step in and take over development?
Do you want me to start?
Go ahead. Everyone take a crack.
Okay, so certainly. For us at NCATS and in the space that we work, we look at it in 2 stages, in the early development stage and the late development stage. In that early stage, right, you're thinking about taking this molecule to the clinic and for commercialization. There are certain activities that need to be considered. One, is there a process that is efficient, cost-effective, and for us also environmentally friendly, that you have to think about, because it won't be commercially viable in that sense. 2, is it safe? Is the data that you received for efficacy or proof of benefit, was that a well-powered study? That, you know what I mean? That's part of the de-risking. No one is going to want to invest in that if you don't have these characteristics. Can it be formulated properly for it to arrive at its destination within the body and produce that effect? All of these things have to be thought of early. And then you have to have that conversation, with the FDA. And then we also have a later stage. But I'll let my fellow panelists continue that.
All right, so for me, I would consider the Valley of Death be a lot of what you said is this early molecule transition into the clinic, and it's really how do you get to your IND? How do you get IND enabled? And for me, that bridge from discovery to IND enablement, that's the really challenging spot to get through and to bring something valuable so that pharma's going to adopt.
First of all, thank you, Danny, for bringing us all together on this panel. I lead a patient foundation, but I'm also a trained healthcare economist. So let's size the market really quick, starting with macro. the United States biotech and pharma industry right now is a $600 billion market, trending upwards by the day. So by 2030, we believe that it will be larger than a $1 trillion market. What's rare diseases' role within that market? Well, before the Rare Orphan Drug Act of 1984, there was a handful of rare disease drugs that were approved. Now we have more than 800 rare disease drugs that are approved. Today, for the first time ever, more than half of the drug approvals are rare disease drugs. Yet, we all know the stats, right? 1 in 10 people affected by a rare disease, 400 million people on the planet, more people in cancer and HIV combined, yet 95% of rare diseases don't have any approved treatment. I don't see that as a problem. I see that as an opportunity to grow. Let's talk about the numbers, right? And define the valley of death. A phase 1 clinical trial can cost anywhere from $2 to $5 million. By the time that we get to a phase 2, we're talking $10 to $20 million. Once we go to a phase 3, that can be anywhere from $15 to $30 million. The cost to bring a drug to market, it's a wide range, but it's anywhere from $300 million to $4 billion, depending on the type of drug, the therapeutic, and the market that addresses. So what is the valley of death within that economic landscape? The valley of death is that most research will not get out of a lab to the bedside of a patient. So getting it from an academic setting to a pre-IND filing and into the hands of patients is where we lose the majority of science and research. And I know we're going to talk about that more, but I just wanted to really specifically define that market and look forward to talking a little bit more about how patient foundations can help accelerate over that valley of death. And maybe one day we'll be sitting on a panel talking about how it's fruitful and blooming.
Well, thanks, Danny, for having me. I would actually say that there are different valleys of death. Each therapeutic modality has its own valley of death. So if you look at a small molecule, the valley of death is probably, even in the beginning, choosing the candidate that Sharie mentioned. But the valley of death will also be the tox studies and the biodistribution studies. For an AV virus, unfortunately, for a viral treatment, the valley of death starts very early on because it's extremely expensive to make virus.
Extensive.
So, yeah, so you have to start getting your resources lined up for AV gene therapy much earlier than you need for a small molecule or an antisense oligonucleotide. So when you, as an advocacy group, look at your portfolio, you can see that you need to advance things that maybe the valley of death is a little later and get some proof of concept and attract some investment or donations, knowing that for AV gene therapy, you'll need to start raising that money much earlier on. So you have to cross several valleys for different modalities.
So one of the things that is cool about this panel is that each of these folks are intimately involved in bridging the translational divide, but taking a different approach to doing that. And I want to walk through that with each of you, but Sharie, perhaps you can start. Can you explain what you're doing at NCATS and how you're trying to bridge that translational divide?
Sure. So I am in the intramural side of NCATS in the Division of Preclinical Innovation. And our branch is the Therapeutic Development branch. We work on both common and rare disorders. One of our programs is the Therapeutics for Rare and Neglected Diseases. And as I indicated earlier, we start for our development from at the time when the candidate is selected until IND. Primarily, the lines can be blurred depending on the needs. To answer your question then. So we do a solicitation. We have projects that come into us through an application process. We evaluate those and we decide on what to work on. Sometimes that is not ready for development. But what we try to do, especially if it's a very promising area, is to look at what's holding back that potential therapeutic and see within, what we can do within our branch. Is there something that we can do to move that, to advance translation for that, to allow it to move forward, to perhaps get additional funding and move into the space that would then allow for development. The second part is we also work on additional initiatives for data science. One of the things that we want to get forward is, we can't treat all of these diseases. Are there ways we can get platform therapies? Understanding, the commonalities between the diseases means that we have to understand how to process all of that data out there and figure out how to, get new hypotheses to address more than one disease at a time. So that is one approach to advancing, translation. I'll add this. This might seem far-fetched, but we're working on a project to infuse equity into preclinical research. Our center's vision is, more treatments for all people more quickly, and the all is emphasized. We're not going to innovate for health if we don't include all, and that means advancing translation as well.
And that theme of working on multiple diseases at once is something we're going to revisit in the next section as well. But Sharie, how do you determine what projects you'll actually work on?
So it is an application process. There's an evaluation, not only internally, but also by external reviewers. We assess all of the scientific dimensions around the project, right? It has to have scientific merit. It has to be ready for development. We also look beyond just the immediate. Is the team that is in place? Is there a clinical plan? There's a chicken and egg, right? Because you might not have the funds for clinical research, but are you surrounded by the team that can take you there in the event that you do get that? Because what we're doing is de-risking in order to attract investments into for further development once it leaves our hands for IND. So then we select those projects, we form our project team. Project management is critical to what we do at NCATS. We, have our project plan and we march along.
And how far will you take an asset in development, and what is the handoff? Is there something you actively do to find someone willing to take up the program?
So it's a collaboration. So who comes in? There's a PI, whether it's from academia, from biotech, from pharma, from patient organization that has, an existing research team. We form that collaboration with them. We work with them. They're the sponsors for, the development. That's not our role. What we help to do is de-risk the molecule, and that allows them to then perhaps either apply for grants, attract further investment, and to take it on. Yeah, we are not involved in that part of it. We just help to de-risk the molecule and allow them to move forward into clinical development.
So a lot of you may know Yael from her work with the Entrepreneur Bootcamp or her time at Ultragenics, but about 3 years ago, is that right? 3 years ago, she founded Mahzi Therapeutics. Can you explain what Mahzi Therapeutics is doing?
So thank you for the shout out for the boot camp. And Matt Fuller, who was running the boot camp at Ultragenics, now is at the conference. So please reach out to him. And if you're interested in participating, I know they're running another boot camp coming up in November. But maybe I'll say a few words about the history of the boot camp. And while I was at Ultragenics, we on a weekly basis got phone calls from tags like yourselves asking, how do we put in place a license agreement with an academic, or what are IND enabling studies? And we decided that instead of doing it one by one, we'll bring all the people together into one room and educate them about the process of drug development. In 2017, when we started, we could barely get 10 groups in the room. We actually had to catch people in the street and ask them if they want to join the boot camp. Fast forward 2024, there's a wait list, and it's become a very sought after event to participate in, and which tells you how things have changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and how all of you have become so active in developing therapies, and how many avenues of support we can provide you with. While at bootcamp, organizing it and participating in it, I realized that these ladies sitting right in front of me, Pankong and Sunita, for example, are doing a lot of work to bring research, to fund research, to find scientists that would be interested in working on their gene. But when the valley of death is reached, where do you go? So during COVID, I seized the moment that VCs were sitting at home bored and looking to invest, and pitched the idea of taking programs that were originally funded by advocacy groups and advancing them into IND enabling studies and into the clinic. And in this way, support advocacy groups and have good products that could potentially get to the marketplace. I was inspired by Michael and FAST. As you know, Ultragenics started a collaboration with the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, and ended up acquiring a company that was started by the advocacy group. And I was really inspired by the ability of an advocacy group to take something so late into development, and wanted to offer PAGs the opportunity to invest in their programs if they have the resources to do so, and thus not only benefit from having a therapy, but also a return on the investment if possible.
So what do you look for in a program? What does it take for you to make the decision to go ahead and take development of something?
Interestingly enough, our first criteria is there an active patient advocacy group that could help us take something into the clinic? Because the drug itself is only the one element of the drug development process. You also need, as you all know, a good understanding of the disorder, the patients, the ages, the clinical presentation, natural history, a registry, whatever could add on to getting to the clinic as fast as possible would come from the PAGs. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We want to work with PAGs that already have the information. So that's our first criteria. If there is a group that is active and supportive, then we would love to work with them. Then in comes obviously the biology, the therapeutic modality, and what data is available, but that's just an add-on.
And what's the funding model? You're venture backed. Do you fund all these programs? Do you expect the patient advocacy groups to supply any funding for this?
So our model at the moment, well, we are venture backed, which is fortunate and unfortunate. But for specific programs, we are working with some PAGs that are funding the research and have the ability to see a return on their investment, just like your model. And in cases where the PAGs are not able to do so, we will take it on and advance it as far as we can go with the funding that we currently have.
And you say as far as you can go, would you actually?
Into clinical trials for sure.
Is the thought that depending on the molecule, or that you might take it all the way to market? Or?
Oh, the intention is to take things to market. It seems so far away now that I'm not even thinking that far back or ahead.
Well, Chris, you're doing something similar but different. Can you explain Devine Bio?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it is fairly similar to what Yael's trying to do. Devine Bio Genesis is very new. 4 months ago, I started Devine Bio, and the premise is to address a question I get from patient advocacy groups, and it's how do we get big pharma to find a therapy for my disease, right? So to answer that question, Devine Bio is saying, let's get in there together with the patient advocacy groups and work together to create value in assets, enough value so that pharma is going to want to take it up and partner with. So where do we got to go? We've got to take it and get it all the way up to IND and potentially all the way into clinic and to efficacy. So how do we pick programs? So Devine Bio has got a unique sort of structure, and Devine Bio is actually an incubator of companies, and we're going to create different companies that are going to be disease-specific focuses, so gene-specific disease, and build multiple modalities towards each one of those. There's going to be no drop of a program with each of those companies because they are going to be working on your disease and moving it forward. So that's one sort of unique aspect. there's five main things that these companies that we're going to create at Devine Bio are going to do, that we're going to call them special purpose exit vehicles, because they're designed to exit with pharma. It's a play on the word SPAC, right? So special purpose acquisition vehicles, just the opposite. We're building these specifically to find an exit by partnering, and we're going to focus on five things. Population is, to me, is one of the very first things that's really important, and that's where the patient advocacy groups come in and play an incredibly valuable role. The things like registries, things like biospecimens, but it can be as simple as basically just getting that list of people who are consented to be contacted about clinical trials. You know, some regulatory issues of patient information have to be sort of crossed, but I think that if we can build up populations of consented individuals to about 1,000, we suddenly start triggering a number, sort of a magic number that pharma says, oh, I'm going to start paying attention to that. Okay, so grow population. Then there's four more things. Biomarkers. That's what Devine Bio is going to be really good at, is helping identify the screening platforms and getting the surrogate endpoints that we want to use in clinical trials figured out. We're going to have to go. So the third thing is going to be go find some candidates, get some modalities, and get a pipeline going. Okay, two more things that are really critical that sometimes are dropped. IP. When we find an academic that's, you know, seeing a really interesting result, and they suddenly go and create a press release around it and shout from the hilltops, oh my gosh, look, we discovered this drug, it's doing something. You didn't capture the IP. We have to be very cautious. And so the really thing is, we're going to have to take, if we get an interesting candidate, file a provisional right away, and be careful about sort of a little bit about how you introduce that out there, so you can protect it, because you need that IP to protect the asset, to keep that value in that asset, or pharma's not going to want it. And the third thing, of course, is what we hear a lot at this meeting: engage with regulatory, get the meetings going, move through, get your safety done, get your CMC figured out. Like, you know, gene therapy has a really big CMC hurdle. Manufacturing is ugly. Our first spec was started just on Friday, Glafabra, and that company is trying to take a gene therapy and bring it to market. Bring it into market. We're picking up an asset that has been proven in clinical trials in Canada, and we're going to just extend those clinical trials in the U.S. and work with the FDA. But the challenge there on getting Glafabra moving forward is that the expense in CDMC in the manufacturing is very expensive. So there's going to be a big hurdle there. So every one of these companies, how do we get them funded? They're going to be funded on this traditional mode, sort of bootstrapped. Go to venture capital, pitch each one of them, try and raise the necessary funding to get ourselves to IND, to get ourselves to the value. Then once we've got that good value, we're going to try and bring those to things like Bio, to JP Morgan, to other partnering conferences, and try and get them placed.
So you say this is because the asset has a company built around it, that you can go out and sell equity in the individual company you form?
Well, because it's basically indication specific, that if somebody wants, if I've been to Bio, and I've gone to the partner meetings, and I call it the Pokemon trading cards, right? You see these groups that are, saying, I've got too many neuro, but I need some more cardio assets. You want to trade me a few of those programs so that I can reinforce myself on a particular portfolio? So that's the kind of thing we're working with, is trying to find those needs that they're trying to fill a better, increase their pipeline, and to build those relationships. And so two more, Devine Bio is incubating companies. It's also built a group of experts that will help us on to go through each one of those steps and get each one of those steps done. And then it's also a platform company building iPSC-based systems.
Obviously, if we could raise venture capital to fund the pre-IND work, we wouldn't have a translational divide. So are you looking to the patient advocacy groups to fund that work preclinically, or is there money out there to do it elsewhere?
The financing model is challenged. I'm not sitting on a big, I'd love it if I had a big fund that was behind me to do this, but right now it's bootstrapped. And so basically it's the classic thing. You've got an idea, start raising money, start getting the seed rounds going, pre-seed money, and so on.
So Michael is the guy who stresses least about the money because he's got it.
Stress about the money, man.
So, so Michael runs a very successful venture philanthropy fund. Maybe you can start just by explaining the problem being a
Absolutely.
venture philanthropy fund solves, and whether that's a model that other groups can think about. You know, is there a minimum amount of cash you really need to make these viable?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I look around this room. Quick show of hands. Raise your hand if you represent a patient foundation. Amazing. Raise your hand if you represent academia, clinician, researcher. Beautiful. And then final, raise your hand if you represent industry, biotech, regulators. We overcome the valley of death when we align the incentives of these three groups in this room. But I want to be really clear. I've had so many conversations with amazing parents in this room. And by the way, looking around at you parents, the Kansas City Chiefs offensive line would be fearful of you. You have the power. You have the voice. You have the knowledge. You have the urgency. You have the funding. It is you. If not us, then who? It is you that is the catalyst to driving this change. It starts with you. And let me offer you a framework of how we can accomplish this. Number one, it's been talked about, but accumulate data. Data is the gold. Data draws academics. Data draws biotech and pharma. Yeah, could we have a sophisticated genomic natural history study in a biorepository? Yes, absolutely. But don't let that be overwhelming. I'm looking at my friends over here that we had a long conversation yesterday, Raging for Raymond. This heroic mom and family aggregated genomic PDFs out of a Facebook group. And she put them on a spreadsheet, and all of a sudden they get millions of dollars of investment from the NIH. That required zero capital to get that going. So start somewhere, organize the community, get data. That is step number one. Number two, collaboration and incentivizing academics to share and work together. That sounds daunting, but it's possible. We started something called an IPSL Consortium for Gene Editing and Epidermolysis Bullosa. 3 research groups applied to us for funding. We said, great, we'll fund you, but one catch, you have to share data with one another. Funding is power. Funding is leverage. Never forget that. Never forget that. Patients are your shareholders. You are investors. Demand to be treated like one. And remember that you can ask for things. By forming an IPSL consortium with 3 universities, we shaved 6 years off of getting to the clinic. For our patient groups, time is the most valuable asset. You all think about it as parents every single day. 6 years is meaningful. Number 3, innovative investment models. For us, that's venture capital. I'm going to challenge everybody in this room that represents patient foundations. Do not put a penny out the door without a venture philanthropy agreement in place. Sounds daunting, right? Let me tell you what's going to happen. You go to a university, we've got some funding. That could be 50,000, that could be 500,000. We've got some funding, but one catch. We'd like to take an equity stake in this research if it's ever commercialized. First thing you're going to hear is a no. I'm looking around at these parents in this room. Do you guys take no for an answer? Absolutely not. And you can have them call me because I've done 130 venture philanthropy agreements in the last 5 years with some of the most major universities in the world, in the United States. It is possible, but you have to push. Why should you be treated differently? If there's going to be economics and commercialization, you should take a stake in that, and you should demand that. If you invest in a company, what's going to happen? Hey, we like shares in your company. You know what? We'll give you a milestone payout. When you do 2x your investment, that seems fair, right? And then my follow-up question, is that what you say to your Series A investors? Is that what you say to venture capitalists that come to invest? Why are we treated differently as a patient foundation? Demand excellence, demand to be treated equally. Now, let me tell you a couple specific examples of how that plays out. EB Research Partnership, when I came on board, EB, for those that don't know, it's a rare, life-threatening, devastating genomic skin disease. 2 clinical trials, not a lot of hope, not a lot of optimism. This was 7 years ago, and we didn't have a lot of funding. We had $1 million a year that we raised. 7 short years later, there's 40 clinical trials, 2 FDA approvals last year, a 3rd one up this year, and more than half of those 40 clinical trials we've directly invested in. But demand equity, demand participation. 2 examples. Number 1, Crystal Biotech. My first year as CEO, we were approached by a little small biotech company for a nominal investment. We raised $800,000. We put it in this company and we asked to be treated like any traditional investor. We had the equivalent of shares in that company. 2 years later, company grows, completes a successful phase 1 clinical trial. We made our funding contingent upon entering into a phase 1 clinical trial. This is how we can work with industry. We exchanged our shares at that time for $2.6 million. So donor gives me $1, I turn it into 2. We helped elevate that. Remember the stats. EBRP doesn't have $5 million for a phase 1. We don't have $15 million for a phase 2. But if you can get it over the valley of death, the market will validate and investment will come. Now, look, lessons learned. If I would have held those shares, it would be a lot different than $2.6 million. But you can't look back, right? You take the cash and you grow. It's a sustainable fundraising model. Example 2. A few years ago, we invested in Stanford University, $500,000 at a university. We put a venture philanthropy agreement in place. If you ask a university to take an equity stake in the IP, it's a non-starter, right? But that's okay. Think outside the box, be creative. So we went back and said, we don't want an equity stake in the IP, but if that IP is ever commercialized, we want an equity percentage of that commercialization of the IP. Okay, now we have something to work with, right? So we put that agreement in place. A few short years later, a publicly traded company came and acquired that IP. They came back to us. We negotiated a deal. We took shares in that company that we liquidated for $3 million. You gave me $1. I turned it into 6. We helped get that IP out of a university and used our network and our patient data and our connections. So it's not just capital, right? It's the power and value that you all bring to accelerate these things into phase 1 clinical trials. Now that's up for approval, which is hopefully the 3rd FDA approval by the end of this year. You can make a difference. You can play in these markets. You can start in a Facebook group. You can make a first investment of $50,000 to $100,000, but put a venture philanthropy agreement in place. And remember, you shouldn't be treated any different than any other investor, but you're going to have to remind people of that. But again, you as parents have no problem reminding people of what you need as a community.
Let me ask you 2 things there. And you alluded to this, but and Crystal Biotech, I imagine, is a perfect example. But how does a venture philanthropist think differently about risk and reward relative to a traditional venture capitalist?
So people always ask me, what's the difference between impact investing and venture philanthropy, right? And there's a complex. We teach a course on this at Yale, and I can talk to anybody who wants to go in more depth. We have limited time today, but I'm gonna highlight 2 things. An impact investor is still return seeking, and they have an obligation to their LPs and shareholders, right? So objective number 1 is always going to be a financial return. And by the way, that's okay. It's what makes market moves. Objective 2 is doing some good, right? Whether that's for the environment or rare disease communities and healthcare. Venture philanthropy, we flip it. For us as a foundation, our shareholders are patients. So objective number 1 is getting a therapeutic in the hands of patients and ultimately achieving a cure. Our mission is to achieve that cure by 2030, and we feel ahead of schedule. Objective number 2 is economic return. How that's different for us from an investment perspective is we'll negotiate, right? Every single deal that we've done that goes into commercialization in phase 1, we've come off of our equity position. We've come down from it. We care about making these things succeed. So a perfect example, there was another asset that we spun out into a venture capital fund. We had a 50% right to monetization of that IP. The venture capital fund comes to me and says, look, there's not a lot of economics here for us to take this into market, right? You have too big of a stake. And I said, great. What do you need in order to make this work? We dropped down to 18% from 50%. We put milestone payouts in place when they raised capital, and now that's preparing to enter a phase 1 clinical trial. So we have the ability and the flexibility to negotiate good deals because our first motivation is actually moving these things forward and getting them into the hands of patients. So that would be the complement to my don't budge when if you don't, it may be a barrier for actually advancing these therapeutics.
You talk about the importance of being treated like any other investor, but I'm wondering if, aside from the financial return, whether you're treated differently when you sit at the table, that you're not dismissed as just a patient advocate, but you're seen more as an equal at the table in any way.
Absolutely. And I think I'm optimistic because that's changing more today. The FDA is putting more value on patient-reported outcomes. The FDA and regulators are putting more value on what you all have to say about your communities. Like now we believe what? From 10,000 to 14,000 rare diseases, the FDA isn't able, like the approvals for EB didn't even have dermatologists on those review panels, right? The voice of the patient needs to be and should be an equal seat at the table, even if it's just for the pure volume of understanding these disease communities and getting approval. So if you can bring capital to the table, data to the table, knowledge, helping with clinical trial recruitment, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's the number one barrier in clinical trials for rare disease. Where are the patients? So many CROs get to work without talking to a patient disease foundation, and then they come back years later and they're stressing and struggling to recruit for clinical trials, and you all raise your hand and say, why didn't you talk to me first? There's an economic incentive to talk to patient foundations as early as possible. CROs budget anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000 to find the name of a potential patient. That's a real number. Who can find patients for clinical trials faster than a CRO? Every single parent and foundation in this room.
So we do have a lot of people in the audience who I imagine are hoping to stimulate drug development in their own disease. What advice would any of you have for patient advocates? How can they help bridge this translational divide?
Before I answer that, can I just add on to Michael's point on what you can negotiate with universities? So success brings success. Obviously, your first negotiation was probably not as successful as your fifth and your 130th. So there are different flavors of negotiating with universities and different asks. So if you think you have an asset that will be potentially successful and you cannot negotiate an equity stake, what you should negotiate is a right to license that asset so that you can control it and not the university. I've seen many advocacy groups make the mistake of give money, and sometimes it's a grant because it's cheaper than giving a sponsored research agreement because there's some overhead associated with it. Make sure that you can negotiate a right to license a first right to license the technology so that when time comes, you can shop it around and not the university. It's not always equity. It's sometimes the power of holding the IP yourself. So that's another strong stance that an advocacy group can take when negotiating with a university. Sorry, I didn't answer your question.
Well, let's answer the question now, though. What can patient advocacy organizations do to really bridge that divide?
Well, so for me, it reiterates on what Michael just sort of said, and he valued it, showed you the value of growing your patient population. And I think that just about any rare disease is going to have the ability to grow to an economically viable population. My favorite example is STXBP1. When I was in my postdoc, I was working on that gene, UNC18, doing studies on it. And then just as I was about ready to leave my postdoc, I heard about it being associated with a rare disease. And I saw that group go from the little Facebook group of just ultra rare up to a very impressive level. They're now just went to their latest investigator meeting. Earlier on, it was just a few academics in a small classroom. Now it's in a place even bigger than this, and there's more people there. They had 6 big pharma there. And why? Because they've just basically crossed that magic threshold. They're at 1,023 patients. Or Melissa's maybe giving me a little more, maybe it's higher now, but they've grown their patient population up to a level that big pharma is paying attention. And so grow your patient population. And part of that is, I think, is it's simple as almost as a spreadsheet where you've got their contact info and the permission from them to be contacted about a clinical trial. Almost just that simple. Now, other columns you can add, natural history information, all that other stuff. You're going to be wanting to build on that. They'll turn it into a registry, but it doesn't need to be too complex at the beginning. Just start getting that data moved forward.
And does the size of a community inform the strategy to any extent? I mean, do you have to think differently about what you drive drug development based on how big a patient population is?
When I've talked to pharma on that one, right? The magic number, and Yael is also sort of, Yael's number I think was 1,500. I've heard others saying it's 3,000. And the bigger the number of the patient population, it can impact how many programs. Fabry disease right now, when it was rare, but now it's grown to such a large extent. It has now 3 therapies in the market and a bunch of others lined up. that patient population now is looking at about 4 million. And that's the size that just about any rare sort of calculates to, nearly 10 billion people on the planet, 1 in 10 rare. That means you've got, on the low side, maybe 1 in 15 rare, right? You've got 500 million people on the planet that have rare. And now take all the genes that are rare, right? Half your genome, that's 10,000 genes divided in there. And now you're coming up with a number that's somewhere around 50,000 potential patients are hiding somewhere out there in the world. So it's a diagnostics problem. You've got to get clinicians trained to sort of diagnose the disease. We need more newborn screening. That's going to be revealing and uncovering. So this stuff's coming on. The rarity is just rare because it's just beginning for you. Your journey can build, and you're very likely to be able to hit that magic number and go well beyond it.
I think often patients who are new to the rare disease world are, first intimidated by the science, which they quickly overcome out of necessity. But, you hear these oft-quoted figures about drug development taking $2.6 billion to get a drug to market. I mean, in reality, we see patient advocacy groups moving drugs into the clinic at a fraction of that cost. Realistically, what kind of dollars do organizations need to think about?
So the 2.6 billion is an average of success and failure.
It's
right?
also capitalized cost over 15
And it's the cost for big pharma mostly.
It's
So
also
it's
policy-driven
obviously
number.
exaggerated, but again, modality dependent. An AAV gene therapy costs a lot upfront, but then becomes cheaper as you go into development because you already made your drug and you can treat the patients. You made the batch in the beginning, and it's usually is enough for an IND enabling studies and for phase 1/2 at least. So it's an investment upfront, but the numbers stabilize. For a small molecule or an ASO, it's cheaper upfront, but then the numbers go up because don't forget, gene therapy is a one and done, so you don't have to come back and get treated in a clinical trial over and over again. It happens only once. So the clinical trial is actually not as expensive. But for ASOs and small molecules, repeat administration, repeat visits, the clinical trials are more expensive. So you just need to, as I said in the beginning, budget in buckets. This is your AV bucket. You have to spend a lot in the beginning. This is your small molecule or your ASO bucket. You spend less in the beginning, but you need to spend more later. So it's just a matter of looking at your portfolio. And I had an interesting conversation yesterday with Andrew Lowe. You probably heard his name. He's the guy who was behind the Bridge Bio model. And he talks about economies of scale, right? If you have a portfolio and you look at it in a consolidated manner and you go to an investor, a donor, and say, over my portfolio, this is what I need now, this is what I'll need later, and this is how I'm going to de-risk the whole portfolio by being a PAG that knows the disorder really, really well, and I have all the tools to develop these multiple modalities, then you have a higher chance of getting someone interested because they know that I have more than one shot on goal.
And in terms of enticing investors to come alongside, I mean, I imagine with your success, Mike, you're able to validate investments, and that alone can help attract people alongside. Having a patient advocate investment in a molecule, does that de-risk things for investors?
Yeah, I think so. And, just knowing this room, right? And it goes exactly to your point. The goal, if we remember the three stakeholders that are sitting here, the goal is to fund academic science to entice industry to enter into your disease area. That may be a $25,000 basic registry that, as you said, now we can understand the disease, we can see the genomic targets or the molecular targets, starting somewhere. Now, if you can fund a $250,000 academic project that's starting to test mouse models and looking at IND filing, then great. But the goal isn't to fund, honestly, past a phase 1 and potentially even a phase 1, incentivize industry and give them the data to be able to be enticed to enter your space. Now, one of the things we talk about patient populations, let's not forget, and I'm less of an advocacy guy and more just do the work, but the one advocacy plug that I will give is to protect and expand the Orphan Drug Act, because regardless of patient population size, anybody that gets a rare disease drug approved gets a priority review voucher. For example, for Crystal Biotech, that went for $100 million. And a lot of your I&D costs are supplemented by the government under this act. So we need to expand that and build that. There's legislation coming forward, 21st Century Cures 2.0. You know, you all have voices and advocacies. We would not see the 800 plus drugs and rare disease if it was not for these disincentives. Fact, end of sentence. And if that goes away, we'll regress. We need to maintain it and expand it and make sure that there is supplements for industry to be incentivized to come into our spaces.
So we're going to open this up to Q&A. If anyone has a question, it's a chance to really tap a lot of expertise on the panel right now.
So I'm actually going to start really quick with the questions we've already gotten in the app. One quick one. Someone would like a definition of IND, please.
Oh, yeah. Well, you guys are probably more qualified than I to take that.
Investigational new drug, and there's application at the end.
Thank you. We also have a question. For rare disease groups who have therapy that gets stuck, what is their best first contact to try to move it forward?
Yeah.
So for a rare disease group that have a therapy that gets stuck somewhere on this pipeline, what is their best first contact to try and move it forward? Who do they call? What do they do?
So we definitely need more information around, you know, what is going on. I want to add something else. So usually when we're in therapeutic development, we get our first interaction with, you know, with the FDA around the pre-IND meeting, but there is an opportunity now for interact meeting way ahead of when you would typically do a pre-IND meeting. And in some cases, my understanding is if there are complexities around the development, that they can actually talk you through that. So the FDA interacting with them, reaching out and trying to, you know, have a meeting about that would be one way to approach
So
that as well.
one of the things we did see was, you know, some young biotechs built these big pipelines preclinically where patient groups had funded, you know, gene therapies or whatever. And all of a sudden, when venture capital dried up post-COVID, all of a sudden these patient advocacy groups that had invested money in molecules that they had a lot of promise in for their future found them just stalled or orphaned. So I think part of that might go to whether you want to include clawback rights of some kind in your negotiations. But, you know, in a case like that, would you have advice for any patient organization?
We do mention clawback, and I think that, you know, absolutely important. In the case of Devine Bio for the specs that we're doing, you know, the agreements that we're talking about, you want to have clawback. You want to be able to have ownership of both the data, any data that's generated based off of your money. You want to be able to own that. And if you've got an asset moving forward and somebody's going to abandon the program, you want to be able to grab that back. You want your agreements to have that. So that's part of the IP, the legal, you know, aspect of making sure you're protected.
Yeah, and just Yael mentioned this, you know, perfectly, but a 30-page venture philanthropy contract is really condensed to two things: economics and control, right? Economics, I'm pushing each of you, make it equity, make it equity, make it equity. Control, absolutely. Clawbacks, if you shelf this and it's deprioritized, we can come back in and pull it out. First rights of refusal, you know, those are all clauses that we have in our contracts that do help maintain not losing an investment and having it be stalled or deprioritized by usually a larger company.
So the same attendee would also like to know, who can we consult with to make sure we optimize trial design for our disease going from phase 2 to phase 3?
So I'm not sure I understand the nuances of the question. I'm assuming that the phase 1/2 was conducted by the advocacy group. That's my assumption. So to get to phase 3, which is your pivotal trial that will hopefully lead you to approval, you need to interpret the phase 1/2 data, first of all, which, so for those who don't know, phase 1/2 is the study where you test the safety of your drug, and you can also explore endpoints. So you need to design the phase 1/2 study in such a way that it will be informative for your phase 3 study, not only what the dose will be, but also what endpoints will be the ones that you can prove that your drug is working. So the design of the phase 1/2 study is actually more important than the phase 1/3. So I would say make sure that your phase 1/2 is well designed and informative so that you can learn from it and design the phase 1/3 to be very pointed at an approval. So who do you consult with? You can come to me. I don't know. You can come. A lot of people know the clinical world well. A lot of medical directors and companies can help. Any company that works in rare will be happy to help design studies.
Anyone else in the audience have a question?
I believe we just got one more from the audience as well in the app. So let's start with that, and then I will come around with the microphone. Is there value in pursuing investigator-initiated INDs for ultra-rare therapies as opposed to traditional biopharma-sponsored INDs for therapies where patient populations are very small, as in under 100 patients?
Try to. I think that depends, right? I think if I understand it correctly, the investigator-initiated INDs, sometimes there tends to be an urgency to move, treat a patient. It doesn't, it costs the same whether it's 1 or 200,000 patients to develop the drug. But those I think they tend to be associated with almost like an urgency situation where perhaps this patient is, declining, and there's a potential treatment available that is in the works. And then obviously that's something that needs to be discussed with the FDA and so on and so forth. That's my best attempt at responding to that.
Thank you for trying. Do you have a follow-up, or would you like to move on to the next question?
I was just going to say, just really quick, I love my academic brothers and sisters, and if I understood the question correctly, I will say that once you get industry, biotech, venture philanthropy, private, public, things tend to go a lot faster because they have investors to answer to. So if I took the question to be academic versus sponsored by biotech or pharma, I would just flag that it tends to move quite a bit faster.
Hi, thank you so much for the very interesting panel. I work as a clinical genetic counselor, and something that was mentioned by Michael is that one of the biggest challenges is finding the patients for these clinical trials. I was wondering if, Michael or other speakers can comment why this is such a challenge. And, I know that connecting with patient advocacy groups was mentioned, but what are some other novel ways that have been proposed, or like what are some solutions to that?
We over here?
Okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to thank you, because genomic counselors, you probably know this, but it's the most in demand and understaffed field in the field of healthcare today. There is not enough of you, so go tell 100 friends, but thank you for you. It is going to be one of the most important healthcare positions that we haven't even started to contemplate how valuable it's going to be. And there's companies like GeneDx, my friends are lovely, and we do genomic sequencing through them and one-on-one health consultations. So thank you. Recruit more friends for the space, because we need y'all. The first thing that I will say, the reason it is such a barrier for recruitment of clinical trials, rare diseases, the numbers are small. Most clinical trials are run in major metropolitan areas, which is a fraction and a percentage of patients, right? Trying to get people in rural areas. And we have a lot of work to do as foundations in a healthcare system for health equity and inclusion. And that means race, that means geography, that means reaching patients that otherwise wouldn't be aware of these clinical trials if they're not at a major academic medical center. So the cost, sometimes some companies don't pay for patients to travel, their airfare, their hotel rooms. the burden, in our space in EB, if you're on a phase 1 clinical trial, you're having to come into the hospital for weeks and weeks at a time, leave your job, leave your family, even just getting on a plane if you have epidermolysis bullosa is a massive undertaking. So, the amount of sites, how many sites are actually running these clinical trials to get the geographic breadth, and I can go on and on. That's just a few. Now, the solution is everybody in this room that runs a patient foundation, making sure that you understand even those rural communities, even those people that aren't academic medical centers, what their genomics are they a fit for clinical trials, right? And that's how we can start to overcome that barrier, but it's a real challenge to find patients. Even EB, 30 to 50,000, recessive dystrophic EB, we think is about 5 to 7,000. We really struggled to get 7 patients for a phase 1 clinical trial. It took years. So you're working with small numbers, and then the challenges within those small numbers make it really challenging, but your work of making sure that patients, regardless of where they're located, understand their genomics and mapping that to clinical trials. We're launching a technology platform next year, and we reverse engineered clinicaltrials.gov. No offense to any government officials, I compare it with going to the DMV, but we made it a more user-friendly experience and actually mapped it to genomics based on genomic counseling. So there is solutions that I think can overcome the barriers.
Just to add on to what Michael said, and this goes back to the conversation that we had yesterday, you guys as advocacy groups should own the list of sites, investigators, and patients. And when a company comes to you and says, where should we place the trial, be able to recommend who the best PIs are to work with, who the ones that you do not recommend working with are, and what the sites are that you think would be most helpful in recruitment. So you can own that list, and you can decide a fate of a site in some ways, which could really motivate some other sites to want to be on your list. And the other thing is a census, knowing where your patients are, who they are, which countries, which states they're in, and being able to link that to the list of PIs would be extremely helpful as well. So a lot of the control is in this room, as Michael said.
So we have to wrap. If you have other questions for the panelists, feel free to corral them. But before we go, I do want to ask each of you to offer one bit of parting advice you can offer people in the audience who really want to be able to take some action to help bridge that translational divide in their diseases. One piece of advice you'd offer?
I'm going to speak from my space. Communication, and there are all of the practical things to bridge that divide. Communication is critical. Having the right expertise that you're surrounded by, and having a plan for how that development process is going to take place is, in my opinion, paramount. And I'm being biased because I'm project management, but it can fail if there is poor management. And yes, there are all of those other practical aspects about bridging the translation divide, but you're not going to do it. It's not going to happen if you fail at managing the business end of it, the administrative end of it, the funding, and making sure the appropriate studies are being done in the order that it's going to inform, each step. So that's what I want to offer.
So my offer is that, one of the most important things that patient advocacy groups can do is basically grow the patient population. You're uniquely suited to do that. I can't really grow it. I can't go figure out who they are. They come to you very well. So organize that. Make sure you protect that data. Make sure you protect that the value of that data, because as you grow it, it's very valuable, and you want that clawback stuff. So grow your patient population and have a strategic plan for how you deploy that valuable asset.
Patient foundations, you are powerful. You have value. You have assets, you have community, you have voice. Never forget it, and don't let anybody ever tell you differently. And run your foundation like a Fortune 50 company. And if somebody tells you no, or something doesn't work, remember that's a stepping stone. You guys are the absolute best and inspire us all. of what you have to go through on a daily basis to overcome, to pivot, to adjust, to not take no for an answer, to get up every morning and put one foot in front of the other, to seek solutions for your children, for your communities, apply the same to business, because you're the greatest group of entrepreneurs that we could possibly imagine.
So you have communicate, count, control, seize. So I'll add on to the control. Control, be in control of what you have. Make sure you have a solid toolbox to offer scientists who want to work on your disorder, a solid understanding that you can educate others on. You control your fate because you own the information.
Well, please join me in thanking this extraordinary panel.